this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or
The
news.
single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Jim Karrh, an expert in managing your message and the author of The Science of Customer Connections, Manage Your Message to Grow Your Business. Jim, you mentioned earlier that people spend 60% of their conversations talking about themselves. You then followed up by saying the tendency actually increases to 80% on social media communications. You attribute the increase to the fact that we can't see the other person losing interest like we do in face-to-face conversations. I often hear this thought that Zoom is as good as face-to-face, which I don't believe is true, but I'm curious to get your thoughts.
It's not as good, Clint, and there are lots of reasons, both in terms of our brain wiring and just psychology and the fatigue. Zoom fatigue is a real thing, and because these environments, this two-dimensional electronic environment, a lot of screen time, the way that you're on screen for most of these meetings, it does tend to wear on us, and it just saps calories out of our brains. So in that sense, it takes its toll. Is it better than not having the conversation, not having the meeting? Well, of course. I mean, we all do. And it's not really a fair test because there's a lot of environmental stress and a lot of personal stress these days as well. Financially, jobs, social, everything else that's going on. And hopefully as this comes out, we're beginning to see some recovery and some turnarounds. But to the communication world of the online versus the offline, I don't know. My crystal ball is no better than anyone else's, Clint. I suspect that we were in some sort of time frame going to be in more of a hybrid type of environment. So there will be maybe more smaller scale meetings and get-togethers, whether they're inside your company, trade associations, community groups, whatever that is. We're kind of getting there in small steps. I do believe that there is going to be a rather durable role for Zoom and other online meeting and collaboration tools.
Sure.
But we're gonna find is people do get tired of it. I think Zoom is a great tool for making meetings more efficient and maybe less frequent. They're not a substitute for conversation, and I think that's where your question really gets.
I agree. I think of it as a continuum where on the low end you have one-way communications like texting or email or posting on Slack. Then you move up to phone calls where you can at least hear the tone of voice and emotions in someone's voice. Then you continue on to the Zoom or video conferencing where now I can see facial expressions or see that they're losing interest. But even then, I can't see if they're taking notes or replying to someone else's email, playing Sudoku on their phone. If you want to ensure the clarity of your message, face-to-face, I believe, offers the best opportunity to achieve that. Plus, when we're face-to-face, even if it's a group setting, I can always tap you on the shoulder. We can move off to the side of the room and have a different conversation. We're not getting that in Zoom because Zoom is one-to-one or one-to-many, and we're missing out on those sidebar conversations, which, of course, can be so powerful.
Absolutely. I was speaking just earlier this week, Clint, a friend of mine who runs across a territory and part of the U.S., a number of offices it's an investment advisory firm, brokerage firm. And he said, we're doing a lot of these meetings with our city leaders and our area leaders, but we sure do miss the times when we were getting together and we would have that hallway conversation right after. Or there's a different vibe and a different level of connection and understanding. But he said, in the meantime, we're doing the best we can with what we have. And if you think back in the days of and they will be getting back together, maybe 2021, coming back strong, association meetings and industry meetings and the like. We've always said that the major learning, the major connections and relationships happen in the hallways. They're not just in the general session or the breakout sessions. Those are useful, of course, but it is that maybe less scripted sort of interaction that is most powerful. But I would also say you have to be a little bit more agile. It's less expected and less scripted. You do want to be prepared. And that's where giving this some intention, some coaching, a central source of what you want to be listening for and saying is so valuable. So again, we don't have that time. Oh, I had Clint in the hallway a moment ago, and why didn't I bring up so-and-so? I'll see if I can find him again. So you're right. It is, I think, a bit of a continuum, a little bit of a hybrid model that we'll be navigating ourselves and for our teams for the next few years.
So if 60 to 80% of our conversations are about us, how can we drive that number down and make it more about the other party?
There are a couple of ways. The first is to recognize that's a problem. It's a solvable business problem, though. I mean, if these conversations and doing it the right way consistently is a major key to growth, then let's treat this as an issue that we can solve. We won't be perfect, but we don't need to be perfect. If your team, if your company is consistently good at this, believe me, Clint, believe me, listeners, you will be head and shoulders above most of your competitors. You will have a big advantage. And it's just managing what comes out of people's mouths and their behavior. You don't have to necessarily change your go-to-market strategy or your business model or your pricing or distribution or anything else. So it involves, I think, a clear plan. It involves a guide. It involves modeling on the part of your leader and your leadership team. And it involves active coaching. What you want to do is bake this into the way that you and your teams meet and the way that they practice and the way that they tell stories to themselves and the ways that they plan, all of that to kind of come in together. This is not like a one-shot campaign. You want to develop more of an organizational competency so you have more people who are best prepared to lead conversations and get the most value out of them for all involved. And it takes, in concept, Clint, a lot of this is pretty simple. The things that we've talked about, nothing is really foreign, right, to common practice. It just means we have to be intentional about it. Know that this is a solvable business issue that pays big dividends.
Another thing you mentioned in the book that certainly resonated with me because I've fallen prey to this as well is that we tend to focus on losses twice as much as we focus on gains. Can we fix that, or is that just hardwired in?
Well, we don't need to fix it, Clint. And as you intimate there, I don't think we can. This is just part of our brains, what psychologists will call loss aversion, right? So we will tend to, and there's thousands of studies about how people will overcompensate for perceived losses or potential losses more than they will for perceived gains. You know, is the bird in the hand worth like 100 of them in the bush? So we have to recognize that. I think it will help us in terms of our message, and as well as our just everyday practices. So oftentimes, what we want to do is, let's say you have something to offer. Let's make sure that our message reflects the exposure or the risk that a prospect would have if they don't follow our advice or if they don't buy our solution or our product, right? So now you can't go overboard. On the other hand, it's like, if you don't buy our stuff, you're going to be out of business tomorrow. That doesn't ring true. It's the whole authenticity piece about this. But recognizing loss aversion in our message and also just in our decision-making, you probably see that a lot in the projects that you help clients lead or when they're evaluating what's going to be a priority. And people can get really skewed in their decision-making and their behaviors if they're too focused on that and if they're overcompensating for that. The other part that comes into this, Clint, is recency, the recency effect. We tend to have something that happened just now is top of mind for us rather than something that happened a year ago. And so if there's something bad that happened recently, know that that's a double whammy on our brains. And so part of the, whether we're trying to work on our messaging or just our management and our decision-making, know that that's just a natural human sort of thing. We have to allow for it.
I know when I'm looking at my portfolio, I tend to look at the ones that have lost, and I don't look at the ones that were 10x gains. I look at the one that lost, and I'm focusing on the wrong thing because this 10 bagger more than took care of the dog that's dragging it down, right? And so what I've learned to do is I organize it now by gains, and I never scroll down. So I just see the positive.
Well, that's very smart. So you've organized your own dashboard, if you will, and the information that you see, and that in a way that you don't make the wrong judgment call for the wrong reasons. And that's very smart. Most of us we could benefit from a little guidance and a little coaching and a little reinforcement to do that. None of us are completely great at doing that for ourselves. At least I'm not, Clint.
Well, I'm a big fan of the Motley Fool for investing, and they will openly admit that if they're going to recommend 10 stocks, 5 are going to be dogs, but the 5 that win are going to be so great, such great winners that it's going to more than compensate for the 5 losses. It's just hard to get mentally, it's hard to get your arms around that, because it's like you keep looking at those, but if we hadn't lost money here, but you can't think about it that way. So I get that.
Yeah. There's one other point of this real briefly, Clint, when you were asking about, when should we stop talking about ourselves and stop worrying about the bad things that are going to happen. These are very natural, whether you're, and a lot of this comes out in my work with sales teams and executive teams. The path that your buyers, the buyers for your idea internally or for your product or service externally, have to go through a sequence of evaluation, and they may or may not be conscious of it, but this is the path it tends to do. First is people evaluate whether they need to change or consider change from the status quo. Then they'll go into a why now. In other words, should this be a near-term priority or just something to think about and put on the back burner? And then, and only then, they'll think about, well, why you? Why your company? Why your product? Why your idea? Rather than somebody else's or me trying to do it on my own. And it's important to get that sequence right. There is a time when you can talk about yourself and you can talk about your features and functions and performance and that sort of thing. But it's more the end of that decision-making cycle. The why us, the why me comes more at the end. And where I can say that if you're trying to get an innovation through internally, get your project approved, or you're trying to sell something to the outside world, the most important thing to do first, and where you need to over-index, is the case for change and why the status quo is too uncomfortable, too risky, too whatever. And then you can move into the sense of urgency, which is the loss aversion, and then why you and your idea, your product or solution is the best choice.
One of the comments you make in the book, kind of going back to the previous question about how do we get it to be 60-80% of ourselves and drive that number down, is I always say you need to listen more than you're talking. And the quote you have in the book is you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And that's the ratio in which you should use them, right? Listen twice as much as you talk. So I think if we do that, if we focus more on the individual that we're talking with, the customer we're talking with, and we listen more than we're talking, we're probably going to be we'll definitely be driving the amount of time we talk about ourselves down and more about them up, which is going to help resonate with our message.
And that mantra is nothing original. I didn't make it up. That's grandma stuff.
Exactly.
Right? That's the stuff that we know and we observe it and we admire it in other people. Our previous discussion about former President Clinton and Mike Huckabee and other people that you've known. Oftentimes, it's interesting, Clint, when you examine conversations, again, it could be job interviews, it could be business pitches, it could be just some sort of business conversation. And we find that the people who say less and ask more are viewed as being smarter, more engaged. They're the smart people because they let me talk about myself. And so oftentimes, if you want to be smart and trustworthy, you think that saying at the margin a little bit more or demonstrating something else a little bit more will put you ahead. It actually tends to work in reverse, that asking smart questions and actually responding to an appropriate way to the feedback that you get, not pouncing, but responding in the right way and tailoring your approach to the situation is going to make you appear a lot smarter and make you more effective.
Well, speaking of being smarter, talk about the role the amygdala plays and how it might be sabotaging us.
The amygdala, as Seth Godin has popularly called it, the lizard brain. It's a little almond-sized deal at the base of our necks. It's basically the very early primal part of our brains would develop first. It was the thing that I guess if our way ago ancestors were coming out of the cave and they, saw the saber-toothed tiger or something like that, it was the fight or flight mechanism. And we still have that. Now we have our far more evolved brains these days, and we imagine ourselves as being way beyond that. But just back to the conversation just a moment ago about the case for change. None of us like change. None of us like threats or things that we may feel exposed, either financially, emotionally, professionally. And so we tend to shy away from risky things. We tend to shy away from elements that make us feel uncomfortable in the moment, and it happens unconsciously. Here's the other part, and where I bring it in a little bit in the book, and where I work with management teams and sales teams. Our amygdala, our lizard brains, cannot process verbal information. It's too primal for all that. So our initial fight or flight is just visual, right? And so oftentimes, if you have a complex idea, a big project, a big initiative, a complicated solution, an investment portfolio that you want to talk about, if you're giving people a lot of words and a lot of just data, it probably won't hit the mark. People will be confused. They won't get it. They may nod their heads and have a glassy-eyed look about them, like they think they should get it, but they really don't. And so oftentimes for your solution, your idea, if you can boil it down to a simple visual. I talked earlier, we were talking about the three-legged stool of managing your message, and people can put that in their mind. It's just kind of easy to remember the concept that way. So one of the things, if you're trying, again, to get your ideas or your products to find the right audience and something that's complicated and valuable at the same time, if you can boil it down to a simple visual, not 17 pie charts, not a whole lot of words, but at some point where you can get the process or the result and have that stick in people's minds, it circumvents our fight or flight response to potential changes.
So this next one was not surprising to me. I will jokingly say newsflash, you heard it here first, but is that handwriting notes increases our understanding better than typing. And certainly that's true for me. I've written 2 books, and both of them I wrote pencil and paper first, and then ended up typing it up. So talk about the power of drawing things out visually. You know, in my world, we draw network diagrams on the wall, which are visual representations of a project. And we find that by doing that, it's a very powerful way for the team to come together, collaborate, understand, and have clarity around what the project really is. So talk about in your world, the power of drawing things out visually.
I'll talk about that in a couple of ways, Clint, because that's a really interesting use case that you just mentioned. The first example that I gave in the book, and this goes back to, for both of us, with our involvement in education, and whether that be in higher ed or corporate training and development programs as well. There are the people who would take their laptops into a class or a training session, and they are tapping away, and they're going to take down just every utterance that comes from. They're going to take pictures of the slides. They're going to everything that comes out of the mouth of the teacher, the trainer, or the professor. And then there are others who are writing it down in a notepad or a journal or notebook. The fact of you're writing it down means you must condense it and you must interpret it in the moment in more of your own language. That turns out to be very powerful. Those students or those learners who do take down notes by hand do better on exams, and they do better in application because they're not just a court reporter trying to transcribe everything that was going on, but they're actually in the moment adapting it to their own level of understanding and their own worlds. So that's really powerful as well. Now, you also mentioned the case of you're getting a project team together and having the members of that team write things out, and they're posting, and you're creating together in real time, it sounds like. When I do workshops and co-creation of messaging playbooks, we'll do much the same thing. So let's have people take a moment, write things out, organize them, put them in sequence. Some things that we may write down, and look, the audio effect here. That was terrible. Let's get rid of that. Let's wind that up and throw it away. Why were we ever using that before? So being able to do that serves a couple of purposes. People do remember it better. They're more engaged in the process. And frankly, they become more involved in the outcome of this as well, because they're contributing to it in a more personal and a more intense sort of way. So, and I wish I did more of this, Clint. I'm not perfect at any of it, and I've got a stack of thank you notes that I'm going to get to soon. But in general, that the power of simple visuals, writing things out by hand, it helps our brains deal with complexity and deal with all the noise.
Earlier you mentioned the game called Telephone that we played as kids, and I certainly use that example a lot when I talk as well about how your message gets shifted. Now, the term you use, which I really like, is your message gets mangled. So what are the marks of a mangled message?
I devote a chapter in the book to it just because. And one of the things we talked about, loss aversion, is people sometimes think less about, gosh, Jim, we really do want to get some new messaging. We need a new campaign, but what if we get this wrong? If we tick somebody off, or we're inauthentic, or people don't like it, or whatever the case may be. And so we're not ready to take that leap. And so I think I mention the mangled messages partly because some of these are so funny and cringeworthy that you can think, oh, well, we won't mess it up that badly. I don't want people to think about mangled messages and the chance of getting it wrong as a substitute for not taking action. All right. So I want to just preface by saying, listen, you're not going to be perfect. You're never going to be perfect. Don't worry about it. Just get in the game, get in the conversational game. But I will tell a brief example, because I think we were talking about education, and this is an example in the book as well. There's a really fine university in Iowa called Drake University, Drake. They have a very good law school, have a lot of really good professional programs. But like a lot of universities, they're really recruiting hard for the best high school students and transfer students. And a few years ago, Clint, they said, we've got to stand out. We can't just do the same old message, a little stodgy, stuffy message coming from the university. The value of our programs, blah, 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 so let's do something maybe a little bit more edgy. They engaged a market research firm to do an online survey of high school seniors, so those who are going to be applying to go to a 4-year program, and an agency to kind of come up with some ideas about how they could get the attention of these high school seniors who are being courted by a number of universities, of course. They came up with this idea for Drake and what they called the Drake Advantage. So they're the usuals that you would want in a university, and then all these other goodies, these other good parts about going to school at Drake. And they came up with Drake Advantage. Their simple mark was D plus. Drake Advantage, D plus. And so they went out and they put this ad campaign out there that had Drake in a big giant D plus on the online ads. Well, let's just think about if you were an alumnus, if you were a faculty member, a staff member, someone in there. Does anything, Clint, come to mind when you think about higher education and a D plus?
Nothing good, that's for sure.
It doesn't smack of excellence, does it? No, it's a really bad grade, and it was one of those that they were so in the moment of the high school seniors of saying, yeah, I'll pay attention to that. I think D plus is kind of cool, that they never asked alumni. They never asked faculty members, staff members, or important other stakeholders. They just went with this thing. Well, imagine, they got a lot of complaints. And they had to very quickly go through and say, hey, we're sorry. We should have maybe run this by somebody who could have pointed out the obvious to us. We got a little bit caught kind of inside our box there as we were trying to do something edgy. And it was fine. It cost them a little bit of embarrassment and a little bit of money of kind of going back to it. But it was just another good lesson. So I would just say, on the one hand, do have a bias for action when it comes to your conversations. Identify them, find the priorities, equip people. Leaders, get out there, do it yourself, be open about this, be public about it, try it, stumble, fumble, it'll be good. But on the other is, do have a reality check about the authenticity and the benefit of what you're going to be saying and how you project that. So if you expect, and this is just a mantra, whether you're doing this yourself or getting some guidance for it, for the people you want to be messengers for your message, involve them or people like them in the process of creating the message. You don't want this to just come from an agency or a consultant or marketing or whomever. If you want people in production, distribution, maintenance, customer service, even the so-called back office of the organization. You want them to be on the same page, involve people like them in the creation of it. You'll get a better product and you'll gain more momentum inside. People will see that and go, I see my fingerprints on it. That sounds like us. And you won't get rated a D+ for what you do.
We're definitely going to come back to that because that's an important topic I kind of want to close everything out with here in a minute. But I saw that you ran the New York Marathon, and I was wondering, how does that fact end up in a book on messaging?
Well, first of all, know that it was a few years ago, more than a few years ago where I did that. I put it in there, I guess, to some extent of maybe showing that I have some tolerance for pain. But it's really the power of persistence. And when I was doing this, it was one of those, I don't want to call it a bucket list, Clint, but it just seemed at the time that would be a neat experience to do. And you don't have to be a great athlete to run and finish a marathon. You need to avoid getting hurt. You need a long training regimen. Where I think this maybe plays into it, and the reason I included it in the book was I had a cohort of people who took an interest in me. I reached out to them. They had done this before. It was a running group that was when I was in Gainesville, Florida at the time in graduate school. And there was a nice connection with that group and the group up in New York City that runs the New York Marathon. And they said, you train with us. I'd never run a marathon before. We will get you into the marathon itself and we'll help you get prepared. And it was a really nice thing. They said, here's about how long it'll take. Here's what you'll need to do. Here's some of the things you're going to feel along the way. You're going to get like 3 months into this thing and you're going to wonder why. And I remember at one point, Clint, it was the first time I'd run 9 miles in a longer session. And I was so tired and I was wiped out. And then it occurred to me, I have run 1/3 of the distance that I will need to run in the marathon. This is crazy. But it was people who had a plan, and it was all the way from how you train, how you stretch, to what you eat, and just to the emotional parts of all this. We would do these long runs together once a week as a group, and then you would do other stuff, in your own time during the week. And we were there for each other. And they had this mantra of plan your run and run your plan. Don't do anything on race day that you haven't done before. Have gone through all of that, knowing physically and emotionally what it's going to be like, and stay the course. You will finish. I did finish. It didn't obviously kill me the way that I thought it might. I even made my time goal. I wanted to do it in less than 4 hours. And so, but I did. Now, I will tell you, Clint, my back, my knees, and my ankles, they had a meeting and they told me that this was not going to be a career choice for me. This is not going to be something that I was going to do over and over. But I do remember that mantra, plan your run and run your plan. And if you're going to transform your messaging, your conversational competency across the organization, I think there's some truth in that as well.
Now, a few minutes ago, you mentioned the idea behind coaching. And I recently had Dr. Craig Dowden on the show, and we talked at length about how to give and receive feedback. What is your experience with feedback during message coaching?
Well, it's certainly, it's supremely important. I think what you have to be able to do in order for your new message, your new conversational plan to really stick, for this to become a competency that builds upon itself. So you've got to have that knowledge base. You've got to be able to have senior leaders and frontline leaders model the behavior, as we talked about before. And then the final part is the showing the way. It's the how. So how do I do that? How do I take this, Clint, if we're having a quarterly business review, how do I do that? If I'm meeting with so-and-so, what are the right questions to ask? Which story should I tell when? What do I do if I get asked something I don't know the answer to? So there are all these specifics that are going to be there. We need our managers and our leaders to be able to share the how. And that's where coaching, in my mind, the coaching part comes in. It's the specifics of it. So you've got people who oftentimes, Clint, I find as those first and second level managers have never really been coached themselves. So they might need some help in terms of knowing how to best do that, how to give feedback, what to look for, how to encourage, and how to stop some other behaviors as well, and equip them sometimes people think of as train the trainer. I think coach the coaches who might not have been coached themselves, and then give them some easy ways in order to be able to do that. I find that especially for this conversational competence, it's good to be able to have training and reinforcement, first of all, for the peer group of managers who have to be coaches, and also for intact teams. So if they're a geographic team or a product team or whatever that might be, of them going in this together as well, so they can see what good looks like. They can kind of stumble and fumble a little bit themselves, and then the repetition of it will help everybody be more fluid, and there's a conscious competency that will arise out of all of it.
Now, as we kind of bring things to a close here, I got two more questions for you. You also mentioned that there's a better approach to new messaging than just short-term campaigns. What is the better way?
The better way is to think of the long game. What is the level of competence and confidence that you want to have across your team or across your company? And so I look at this as whatever your growth plan is or your innovation plan, there are probably some small set of conversations that are really critical to it happening, to you hitting your goals. I'll give you a quick example, a small example, but an important one. This was a company that's in the HVAC world, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. So they're the people who are, for both businesses and for residences, they're going out and installing equipment, maintaining it, and troubleshooting, and all of that, and air quality and filtration, which of course is a big deal these days. What they found is that most of their conversations with customers weren't going through their call center or their dispatch or their leadership. It was through the on-site technicians, the techs, the people who actually showed up to do the work. And so what we wanted to do was to be able to equip those to be able to find problems more easily, to be efficient, and to have some confidence that if they found other areas that they could help sell or at least make customers aware of them from the product portfolio, that that's what they wanted to do. Now, these were not salespeople. They didn't get into the job of being a tech to be a salesperson. We're not trying to force fit someone in there. But you can identify a few critical conversations, again, whether you're selling to the outside or selling on the inside, that you need to get a competence around. And so that's a long game, Clint. That's not a short-term promo or handing out some sales collateral or trying to get everybody to take a body language course inside. No, what we want to do is get something that builds upon itself over time. So you think about, we are going to be effective, consistent leaders of the most important conversations in and around our business, and that's going to be part of our culture. So once we get that messaging in place, we create it together, we role play it, we practice it, we talk about it every single day in how we meet and how we reward and how we recognize, and then we're going to have a long-term advantage for doing something that most companies don't do very well at all.
So let's close with this sentence from the book, which I found to be very powerful. When you expect different groups of messengers to eventually be on the same page, especially if there's a separation by location, business unit, seniority, or even language, it's important to involve people from those different groups in creating the message itself. Now, the reason that resonates with me is when we work on large projects, we fly people from across the globe into the room to work face-to-face over a period of days or weeks for that very reason, because they are geographically dispersed. They have different languages they speak potentially, and we have to establish the relationships between ourselves, but then also have a better understanding of the process and of the project plan. So I really like what you said. You mentioned this earlier, but I thought it was a very powerful statement and a great way to end this conversation.
We touched on this a bit before, Clint, and I'm just imagining in those sessions that you have, and I've read some of your work and listened to your work too, and I'm paraphrasing here. You will tell me how I managed to mangle this, but we can't be in a big project meeting, or we're looking at implementing a big initiative, and if Sylvia or Curtis aren't in the room, we can't give them something to do, right? They have to agree to it. And so, and in the mix of all the other things they have going on, that's how you build accountability and how you build implementation, and you have a much higher chance of project success. You can just throw something out there. You can have the marketing team or the sales team get together, or heaven forbid, a consultant who comes in and it's that person's idea, and say, well, if we just do this stuff out there, then everybody will do it because the message is so great. Well, no, because people won't adopt it as their own. They'll know it came from somebody else who doesn't do their job, who doesn't have their relationships, and who would not say it that way. So that whole part about if you want a better quality plan, you want a better quality message, and you want to build more momentum inside that gives you a much higher chance of people actually using the thing in business, that's what you want to do. You can't get everybody involved in it, especially at a big company, but you do want to be very intentional about involving people from different groups that you want to serve as messengers and role models and coaches. They need to be intimately involved with putting this all together.
I think that it's also true that maybe the person that gets invited that comes to the meeting didn't actually end up adding any content, but now they listen to all the conversations, they understand the debate that went on, and they understand why the message is what it is, and are better able to articulate that as they go out inside the organization or to the customer.
That's right. They go back to their business unit. They go back to the Pacific region. They go wherever. Hey, Clint, what were you doing? Well, here's this thing that's going on, and it seems to be pretty important, and here's what our role is going to be. So they are actually, either whether they're conscious of it or not, they become messengers for the project, right?
Exactly. Well, Jim, it's been a pleasure having you on the show today. If people want to reach out and learn more about you or buy your book and learn why all wristwatch ads look alike, how can they do that?
Nice tease there, Clint. That is, we didn't tell that story, but it is a fun one. My website is the source for a lot of stuff, and the toughest thing that your listeners may have to deal with is the spelling of my last name. It's Karrh, jimkarrh.com. A lot of resources that are there. The book is available through all the usual channels, Amazon, Audible. It's an audiobook, it's paperback, it's Kindle, it's wherever you find business books, called The Science of Customer Connections, Manage Your Message to Grow Your Business. One other thing, and Clint, I've found this is a pretty cool thing. I host a podcast. You know, I think there's something to these podcasts. Mine is called the Manage Your Message podcast, and we cover all about the message and building a base of messengers and the right management habits to keep it fresh and consistent. So I'd also invite connections on LinkedIn. That's where we're not beating up all the social platforms here. I think they can be useful, and that's where I tend to hang out the most. So I would love to be have that connection. And if any way that I could help any of your listeners as a sounding board, or maybe helping them inside their companies or for their associations and teams, I'd be happy to do so.
Thanks for the conversation, Jim.
Thank you, Clint.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.